All right, good evening, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Good week so far. Up and down weather, but hopefully a upward trending week. Always look forward to getting to be together on Wednesdays and, of course, on the Lord's Day as well. We are in Genesis 19, 20, 21. It's the kind of the range. We'll kind of recap 19. Brother Jim was wondering how we would cover these big gaps in text, and hopefully we won't leave anything out. I maybe have an additional question to ask, here and there in between gaps that Brother Padfield might have in his questions. But we'll stick to the workbook, but certainly want to look at the chapters in their entirety and at least get a summary idea of what's in there. Remember last time we dealt with chapter 19, in which Lot found himself back against the wall, literally, with the men of Sodom, who were looking to have their way with these two angels. Of course, not knowing that they were angels, they're struck with blindness. Lot sort of stands his ground, at least for the case of the angels, but then he had offered his daughters instead. One of those difficult texts that we wrestle with, but we see that God continues to provide, even for Lot, the nephew of Abraham. And we looked at also last time how the angels tell Lot they need to get out of there, but then the next day comes and they urge him, and yet there was always this hesitation, and we kind of bandied about it a little bit, just kind of wondering what was it that Lot was hesitant for. Could it be material things or what have you, or just concern for other people maybe within the city that he had relationships with, or whatever. Who knows what all may have entailed in his lingering, but they were urged, and they finally are brought out. Lot negotiates and asks them to compromise, let him stay in the city called Zoar, which is not far from Sodom, and yet it certainly wasn't far enough as Lot's wife turns and looks at the destruction going on in Sodom, and she's turned into a pillar of salt. Then we also talked about yet another difficult section in the same chapter with Lot and his daughters, and we kind of left off there talking about the ramifications of this sin between Lot and his daughters. Lot's direct sin would have been that he allowed himself to get drunk and was basically so inebriated that he didn't seemingly know what was going on with his daughters, and they both slept with him and had children by him. And so that brought about two new nations. We'll get to talking about Ishmael again tonight, but we have the Ammonites, the Moabite and the Ammonite people, and the further ramifications. We said Baal worship was introduced to Israel by the Moabites in Numbers chapter 25. The Ammonites and the Moabites both tried to curse Israel through Balaam in Deuteronomy chapter 23. And so while we process all of these bad events in the life of Lot, still yet we balance that with considering the fact Peter calls him righteous more than once. And while we wrestle with that again, the perspective, and that might be the word for the night for us, and you'll see why a little bit later on too, but the perspective that we need to remember is, in the end, in which the inspired writer Peter was able to say Lot was righteous, he had a better grasp of Lot's lot on life than we would, because we're only getting a snippet of Lot's life. We're only getting some of the highlights or lowlights as they were. And so as much as we might wrestle with how do we understand Lot and all the rest, at the same time we should also understand that he was considered righteous. And certainly by comparison to the people of Sodom, I think we can see that, but perhaps more so in the totality of his life, that he was a righteous man. Any thoughts or comments before we move on to question 25? That was the crash course. You can tell that in the rambling there.
Lot didn't want to go to the mountains, and he went to that little town, and then it says he went to the mountains. I wonder if he went to the mountains that God originally told him to go to. It's not an important thing, but I just kind of wondered.
I don't know. I hadn't thought about that.
Well, like I said, it's just one of those odd thoughts.
Okay. All right.
I didn't want to go, but then he wound up in the mountains.
There you go. God's will always plays out in the end anyway, and we'll certainly see that again with Isaac and Ishmael in tonight's reading. So we get to chapter 20, and the first 18 verses. That is the first 18 verses, all of the 18 verses of chapter 20. We've got one question for one chapter. And the question is, what sin did Abimelech commit? As you see there in verse 1, from there, Abraham journeyed toward the territory of Negeb. And I think I closed last time by saying the from there of 20 and verse 1 could mean from where Abraham looked down on Sodom and Gomorrah, or where he pitched his tents in chapter 18 and verse 1. But the question may be whether Abimelech actually sinned. Did he actually sin? Would be a question I would have.
I know he took Sarah, but he honestly didn't know that she was married, so it's hard for me to see that he sinned.
Right. Yeah. That would be my question. Did he actually? On the front end, we could say that he shouldn't have taken Sarah to begin with, because he already had a wife. So from that angle, as you see there, Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech and also healed his wife and female slaves so that they bore children. But we also know that Abraham had Sarah for a wife, and really by, would you say by proxy or by default, had another in Hagar, because he had a child by her. And so if we're comparing scorecards here, Abraham and Abimelech may not be all that different in that regard as far as their marital status. Brother Danny?
Your question, maybe verse 6 gives us a little insight on that. God says, when he appeared to him, I've kept you from sinning against me. Right.
I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart, and it was I who kept you from sinning against me. Therefore, I did not let you touch her. And yet, we also see that they are inflicted from the standpoint of Abimelech has something wrong with him, and then at the very least, what's wrong with his wife and female slaves is that they were unable to bear children. And so there was that measure on the front end. But as Brother Danny pointed out there in verse 6, after Abimelech asked the question, Lord, will you kill an innocent people? Did he not himself say to me, she is my sister? And she herself said, he is my brother. In the integrity of my heart and the innocence of my hands, I have done this. And so Abimelech's confident in his standing that he did not do anything contrary to God's will, at least from where he's standing. Mike?
God kept him from doing it.
Right.
But what was Abimelech's intent? What was his heart leaning toward? It had to be to take her as a wife.
Mm-hmm.
So God kept him. God knew he wasn't sinning.
Right.
He kept him from sinning. But I think the intent was that he was going to take her for a wife.
Uh-huh.
And I think God does his heart. And that's why God does his judgment. He does your heart by the way.
Okay. I hadn't thought of that angle, but yeah, he and obviously in that time we also have David, who had multiple wives. We have Solomon, who had a whole lot of wives and concubines. We're talking about 1,000 different women that he had in his household, and so this is Old Testament times. It's not that God approved of this way of living, but go ahead.
Excuse me.
No, you're
another
fine.
point we can get from, I think, this is that man has always been under God's law, whether it's Abimelech or whether it's the people of Sodom and Gomorrah, not in the scope of the history we have recorded for us of the nation of Israel and so forth, and
Right.
the laws, but they've always been under God's law.
Right.
And so there's been requirements. Nobody's been exempt from obeying God. Abimelech wasn't. Whether or not this incident was a sin, like you say, the customs of the time and so forth were so much different. But this event and others just show us time again that God's law has been for all mankind.
Right.
Not just the Jews.
Right, valid point. And even in thinking about the time frame of Abraham acquiring the land of Canaan, obviously it's not going to really be in his time, although he settles there for a time. But what was the precursor that God said before this land was actually ready? He's going to deal with the inhabitants of that land. He was going to bring judgment upon them. Well, they're not Israelites, and the nation of Israel hadn't even been formed yet. It was just a promise at this point to Abraham. And so that's a great point to consider. God is still the God of all the world. He's the creator of the universe. He holds judgment over the entire world, and certainly all of these different nations and all of these different narratives that we're reading in Genesis. God is holding court over them, holding judgment over them. So how do we understand this issue for both of these men, let alone others we read of in biblical texts? I prepared for us to get into this idea of the likes of David and Solomon and Abimelech, who was going to take Sarah, and Abraham having Sarah and Hagar, and we'll see countless other examples throughout Scripture of men having multiple wives. Do we ever read of God's condemnation of polygamy?
By Jesus.
By Jesus, okay? Do we ever read, let's go with the typical approach to things written or not written in the Bible. Does the Bible ever say, thou shalt have only one wife or only one husband? We don't read that language, and so there might be liberties taken from that angle, but we do read in Genesis 2:24, which we've already covered. Therefore a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And this is the passage that Jesus refers back to in emphasizing this oneness. And certainly going forward, we see the importance of that unity and that oneness. In Deuteronomy 17 and verse 17, the future king of Israel was to, quote, not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away. We certainly see, I believe, with Solomon, that was a problem. 1 Timothy 3, 2, and 12, in the qualifications for elders and deacons, both are called to be the husband of one wife. And so I don't know of any situation that I've ever heard of a church really considering a guy, but man, he had one too many wives, and so he was disqualified. Usually not an issue that we ever read of in the church. We come to that understanding, and certainly it's clear, especially for those offices within the church, that phrase that we get one wife from, as Titus 1:6 states this again for elders. The literal translation for this is a one-woman man, okay? They only belong to one. It is one for one. And so we would all agree that the other listed qualifications too are expectations for all Christians. When we look at 1 Timothy 3 and look at elders and deacons, we've made this point before, I think leading up to whenever Josh was appointed as a deacon, talked about how these expectations should really be the expectations of all Christians, but it's the ones that are living up to that standard and have held themselves to that standard that truly do qualify, but including the one-woman man kind of mentality as well would apply. Brother Charles?
all the things I believe are exactly right on. Of course, but if you look at the scriptures and see how the church is the bride of Christ, and we see the oneness, so one Lord, Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God, Father of all, above all, through all, and
Yep.
all.
Yep.
If the church is a marriage relationship compared to the Christ and the church, still in one church. There can't be multiple wives in churches.
Right.
So I think it was always God's intent. Man didn't always follow God's intent.
Right.
But we look back at the Old Testament, see that quite often.
Right.
No, I think it was his intent, but he made it a lot more clear under Christ's law.
Right.
I believe that was we see his intent. And even there in the comparison of Christ and the church, the man and his wife.
Right. I think that's a great point. I was going to get to Ephesians 5, but that's exactly right. When you think about Ephesians 5, and you just look there, in Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, it's a passage we've looked at time and again. It's a great passage on marriage, but also it is a passage that tells us a lot about the way God looks at Christ and the church. As Paul says at the end of this section, this mystery is profound, and I am saying that it refers to Christ and the church. However, let each one of you love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. And so, in essence, in those two verses, that is the thesis statement of the section, that it is about Christ and the church, and it is about husband and wife relationship. Both are to be the same. And to Brother Charles' point, I think it's completely valid when you look at all of these examples where a man had more than one woman. You have Abraham and Sarah and Hagar right there. You have all these other situations with Solomon and with David, and he brings in Bathsheba. All it does is when you bring something in and turn one into 2, 3, 4, 5 or more, then you're creating division, and then there's not a unity there. There are not two to become one flesh. There are multiple, and that certainly has implications on a marriage from man to woman, and certainly, as Brother Charles was pointing out, with the church, that there is a oneness that was always intended by God, and I believe we can tie that all the way back to Genesis chapter 2. The only benefit to polygamy that you might say at that time was to the societal or financial struggle that would have been present in ancient days in that culture. This was a suggestion I believe I read. Still yet, I agree with Brother Charles. It was never God's intent. It was not God's design for marriage from the beginning. And Jesus answers the question of divorce in Mark 10 by speaking to the point of two becoming one flesh. Again, going back to Genesis 2. Now, as far as the text goes, Abimelech and his household were temporarily punished, as we see back in Genesis, 20, right? And we see that in verses 17 and 18. But Abimelech had said in verse 9, "How have I sinned against you that you have brought on me and my kingdom a great sin?" And so Abraham's part in this is that he was deceitful, and he essentially explains his whole thought process and his tactics in verses 11 through 13. So if we are ever wondering why would Abraham continually take this approach, any new place they went to, any new land they went to, look there in verse 11, back in Genesis chapter 20. Abraham said, "I did it because I thought there is no fear of God." And there's the problem right there, isn't it? I thought. Well, he thought wrong, didn't he? I did it because I thought. So what else can be implied? I did it because I did not trust what God had told me. I did it because I was scared. I did it because I didn't want to lose all that I had, and I cared more about my life than I cared about my wife's, honestly. Right? That's the scenario. I did it because I thought. And so there is no fear of God at all in this place, and they will kill me because of my wife. Well, was that an accurate assessment? How did Abimelech feel about God?
He listened to God. God talked to him directly.
Yeah. Abimelech was trying to defend himself. I didn't do anything. And so Abraham is basing his decisions on assumptions. Then in verse 12, here's where the straddling of the fence comes in. Besides, she is indeed my sister, the daughter of my father, though not the daughter of my mother, and she became my wife. And when God caused me to wander from my father's house, I said to her, this is the kindness you must do me. At every place to which we come, say to me, say of me, he is my brother. And so there was Abraham's thought process there. And let me see, I think I have the right one. I have an expanded look at this that I found hopefully helpful. In Truth for Today, again, when this sad incident is viewed in the broader context of the Genesis narrative, it almost appears that Abraham had forgotten how God had called him from Mesopotamia and had blessed him abundantly with large flocks, herds, and riches. In addition, he had hundreds of fighting servants. We read that back in chapter 14. In fact, he may have had the largest private army in Canaan. Why was he so afraid then? Had he lost his faith? Did he no longer believe the words of God? Do not fear, Abram. I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great. Chapter 15 and verse 1. Did he not trust in God's promise made so recently that within a year he and Sarah would have a son, and she would be the progenitor of kings and nations? Chapter 17 and verse 16 and 17, and chapter 18 verses 10 through 14. This was surely a low point in Abraham's life. By giving Sarah to Abimelech as a wife, he was ready to jeopardize the promise of God that a child born to her would be from his own body. Have you ever thought about that before? Certainly God is at work in this, and God is continuing to provide. He is this God of promise. But at the same time, Abraham's not really doing all that he can to hold up his side of the promise by allowing his wife to continually be taken by Pharaoh, by Abimelech, and so on. And so, again, I know we're trying to straddle the understanding of Abraham, just like we have been with Lot, of understanding overall they were righteous men, but we're getting glimpses in their lack of faith, which, again, if the book was written about us, we would see those moments in our own life as well. And so, again, not trying to just beat up on Abraham, but all of these things that God has told him over and over again, and what he's provided for him materially, and what to look forward to in the future. And Abraham is continually thinking for himself and weighing in on his own feelings of how this situation is going to unfold. And so, in the time frame in all of this, that he's going to be blessed with a son and all of these things, and yet he continually comes back to this point because he's thinking instead of trusting in that moment. Brother Jim?
Well, I kind of wondered, as reading this and studying it, I kind of wondered if Abraham was trying to substitute Abimelech as a progenitor of his son, like Sarah tried to use Hagar as a production of her son. Yeah. And Abraham, though he thought God was not in this place, he allowed Sarah to go there to be wife of Abimelech, which would prove out to be his wife, and whatever son was created would prove out to be, quote, his son, end quote.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that aspect. And maybe he's thinking, well, here's a nation already started with Abimelech, and so we're getting on the fast track here of this nation being started, because he's still having to deal with things from the future. And we might wrestle with too, and I have in times past, but I think I've come back to this thought before. While God, it never seems that God just out and out blasts Abraham for his lack of faith in these moments, Abraham is getting a dose of humility in his interaction with these kings as well. He's getting shown, why would you do this to me? And later on, we'll see that Abimelech can see for himself that God is there for Abraham. God is the God of Abraham and will be of Isaac and Jacob going forward. But maybe that is part of how Abraham gets humbled. Certainly, God does that for us with certain people in our lives, where he allows someone else to influence us or humble us when we start to get a little bit big for ourselves or whatever the case may be, and we get leveled out by someone else. And maybe that's the case here for Abraham. Mike?
I think that the promise God made Abraham would stand as long as he kept his commandments. I don't know the commandment that Abraham had broken. Now, he was pushed to act, but he never broke God's commandment. So therefore, that's why I think God would not let Sarah become the wife. In reality, of Abimelech is that promise was going to hold so long as Abraham fulfilled, was faithful to God and didn't break his commandments. If he didn't fulfill one commandment, he hadn't Abraham broken. I mean, he did some, morally sensible things here.
Yeah.
But what commandment had he broken with God? And so that bond was still intact.
Yeah, I mean, he followed God's direction to go to start with, and he did. And there are hiccups along the way, and God was certainly intervening in a lot of moments, and so I can see from that standpoint. And just as God kept Abimelech from sinning against him and full on taking Sarah as his wife, God has intervened as well for Abraham. I mean, I think you could make the argument in chapter 20 that God has kept Abimelech from sinning, yes, but he's also kept Abraham from breaking, from being severed from the covenant as well. Danny?
When I think about this, and there's a lot of things we don't really have all the insight to.
Right.
Because we know how Abraham turned out and what he was able to do.
Right.
So this progression, it went in God's way.
Mm-hmm.
There were issues along the way,
Mm-hmm.
but we see the faithfulness of God in this. He
Yes.
stood by him,
Yep.
and that should be a lesson to us.
Right.
We hope and pray that continues for us, because we're going to need it. And we see here in Genesis 12 and Genesis 20, Abraham has a problem with repetitive deceit. Wow. Look, think about us.
Yep.
Do we have that kind of problem?
Yep.
Do we have to kind of hit ourselves in the head, I've done this again, or I failed to do this, or I was trying to do better, but look what happened. We have that same problem,
Right.
that we repeat things that we shouldn't have done. And both of these events should be an encouragement to us that God's faithful, and we need to repent and change and get back on line with His will.
Right.
And His faithfulness will pull us through. So these stories of Lot and Abraham, and we see all these events, and I see God's faithfulness in all that.
Yes.
That He is steadfast. We can count on Him. I might not be able to count on me, but I can count on Him.
Right.
And if we have that faith, we can finish like Abraham did.
Right. Absolutely. Like we said time and again, if the book was written about us, there would be some low points for others to read about us as well. But again, in the totality, in the overall picture, Abraham was considered righteous and faithful. He had hit his bumps along the way, but to Danny's point, we certainly see that God was steadfast. He was faithful to Abraham. He was going to be there for him. And we don't have to understand all the ins and outs of all these things, but see that God is the same with us today. How many times have we had those, as Danny was talking about, head slapping moments or head against the wall moments where, how could I have done this? How can I be so foolish? And yet God is there to continue on with us, to continue to be willing to lead us if we would follow. Anything else before we get to 26? Okay. Question 26. How did Hagar react to Isaac in chapter 21, verses 8 through 9? And then what did Abraham due to Hagar and Ishmael in verses 11 through 14, and was this in the plan of God? So we've got a 3-for-1 special here with this question. But before we get to verses 8 and 9, first we need to recognize the first 7 verses. Of course, notice God's announced time turned out to be the time, and Abraham names him his son Isaac and has him circumcised per God's commands. There you see it in verse 1. Excuse me. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age, at the time of which God had spoken to him. Abraham called the name of his son who was born to him, whom Sarah bore him, Isaac. And Abraham circumcised his son Isaac when he was 8 days old, as God had commanded him. Abraham was 100 years old when his son Isaac was born to him. And Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said to Abraham that Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age? The way these 7 verses are captured, is it not just a testament to the doubt that they had, and yet God is answering each and everything that he said he was going to do, the way he said he was going to do it, when he said he was going to do it, with whom he said he was going to do it with, and it's made clear this is Abraham's son, and this is the son that Sarah bore. No other route needed. Hagar was not needed for this. Abimelech was not needed for this. This is Abraham and Sarah's son, the way God said it. It was done in their old age, and it is the son at the time in which God said it that they would have one, and he is named what God said that he would be named. Notice too that Sarah, maybe she gets the irony of Isaac's name here, because she talks about laughter herself. She discusses the laughter that others will have over her giving birth so late in life. We know Isaac's name means he laughs. She's concerned or just maybe chuckling that there's going to be people that are going to be laughing over me when they hear how old I was in having Isaac. And of course, it was first announced that Isaac's name would be Isaac after Abraham had laughed. And so it's kind of come full circle here. Abraham laughed, Sarah laughed, and now she's concerned about other people laughing at how this has all turned out. But perhaps this is one of those what goes around comes around kind of situations. Anything about those first 7 verses that you would like to pull out before we move? Yes, sir.
How long was Abraham supposed to have this child? 25 years?
I think that's about right. Wasn't it 75 when he was promised?
Right. And he's been promised this for 25 years, since he was, in a lot of people's mind, too old to have a child to start with.
Right.
And Sarah was, when he was 75, she was 65.
Yeah.
And he's been dealing with this for 25 years.
Right.
And it's no wonder that when he was told he was going to have a child, that he might have chuckled and said, yeah, me, I'm,
Yeah.
And Sarah chuckled and said, yeah, I'm going to have a child, And she laughed, and the angel pointed her, the man pointed her on that, no, you did laugh.
Right.
And she tried to deny it, but isn't it clear in these 7 verses that Abraham is now having to deal with what he thought he was going to deal with for 24 years now?
Yeah. Yep. And so how everything turns out the way that it was supposed to, and I don't know if it was you or someone else who had pointed, if they hadn't gone the route with Hagar, did God extend the time just because they showed the lack of faith in that moment and went with the route with Hagar? Who knows how that may have toyed with the spectrum of God's timing. Of course, God knew when he would do this to start with, but the end game was the end game. It was going to be Isaac through Abraham and Sarah nonetheless. But again, this time frame, which we are always obsessed with time, God shows that his timing is what matters, regardless of what we think of it. So then we're asked the actual first question in this line of questioning in chapter 21 with verses 8 and 9. How did Hagar react to Isaac? This must be a misprint. I looked at a couple other translations in addition to the ESV. I think it really should be how did Ishmael react to Isaac? Right? Because what happens in verses 8 and 9?
He laughs. Ishmael laughs.
Right.
Makes fun of it, laughs.
Right. Ishmael laughs. It wasn't actually Hagar in verse 9, but Hagar's son Ishmael, who was, the ESV says laughing, the New King James Version uses the word scoffing, and the New American Standard uses the word mocking. So it's not like a laughing, jovial type that I don't believe that we're supposed to surmise here. And what would this laughing, scoffing, mocking be in response to? What's going on in this context?
Isaac is being weaned, and a party is being thrown for the fact that he's being weaned,
Right.
which would make him in those days probably in the neighborhood of 2 years, 8 months, 3 years, 4 months.
Okay. All right. And so here Ishmael is obviously old enough to understand what's going on, and he's laughing, mocking, scoffing at this. A sense of jealousy, it would seem to be. This feast is being made for Isaac. And so what happens in response to this? We're not to verse 11 yet. What's going on in verse 9? Who saw Ishmael laughing, scoffing? Sarah, right? Sarah's had a little bad taste in her mouth before about Ishmael and Hagar, hasn't she? Right? So what does she do?
Well, this doesn't make it as clear what she did and why she did as the New American Standard does.
Okay.
The New American Standard makes it more clear that she is pointedly aggravated to the point of asking for him to leave.
Yeah.
And when he scoffs or mocks, that's more than just, like you say, that's more than just a jovial laughing. That's making fun of her son. That's mocking her son. That's putting her son down.
Right.
And her son is to be the one through whom kings and nations are formed.
Right.
And not Ishmael. And therefore, the English Standard puts a bad light on Sarah because it makes it look like she's doing this because Ishmael just laughed. No, Ishmael didn't just laugh.
Right.
He mocked. And if you'll go to Galatians 4:29, it says that Ishmael persecuted.
Okay. All right. Good point. Yeah, I think this is one where, the ESV has a footnote about the word laughing. It says possibly laughing in mockery. And I believe that would be for her to react in this way. I don't think she would just respond that way if he was laughing about something jovial that's worth laughing about. And within the immediate context in verse 8, I think we can conclude he was laughing about what was being done for Isaac in a mockery type of way. And again, it would seem as though a sense of jealousy. Brother Charles?
You see here that over all these centuries, human nature has not changed. Look at the mockery of an older sibling, which more like what you're saying, to the younger, teasing to the point of maybe harassment.
Right.
And the jealousy that existed between them. Man hadn't changed a lot.
Yeah.
Centuries of it, we haven't really learned a lot of what was happening.
Right. But to your point, you were the baby of your family, right? And I'm the oldest in my family, and I was never jealous of my brother. I had no reason to be. No, I'm just kidding. I'm kidding. Point well taken. Brother Danny, do you have something?
This is one of those chapters that if you know the end of the chapter first, you can understand, you see the providence of God in all this.
Yeah.
His intentions for Isaac, and Sarah is playing that role that she does not want Ishmael to be an heir in that regard to Isaac. Mm-hmm. God doesn't either. Mm-hmm. And so he's going to take care of it.
Right. He is, and we'll see, we're only on Sunday, how this unfolds. Just long answer short as far as what Sarah does, she tells Abraham to cast out this slave woman, verse 10, with her son, for the son of this slave woman shall not be heir with my son Isaac, which is a true statement. And on the surface, we might say, well, Sarah's acting pretty cold-hearted here, but at the same time, God's will is unfolding, and it's all coming together here, and we'll see more of that, Lord willing, on Sunday. Thank you all very much for your comments.